All right, so in this part of my talk, I will be discussing to you the philosophical stance, or otherwise known as the philosophical assumptions in research. Okay, so my talk will focus on these two goals. At the end of the talk, you are expected to identify your own research paradigm or your worldview and familiarize with the major philosophical assumptions. Let me start by asking you this question. Okay. What do you consider when you give your opinion to an issue? For example, like teenage pregnancy, depression, or voting for a certain politician. May I know? Maybe you can just chat it on the chat box, and also chat there what are your considerations on sa may mong kanang pinakaunang hunahunaon as you give your opinion to this. Let me see. The audience, I see here the audience. What else? Okay. Your beliefs. Okay, Christelle answered here. Beliefs and standpoint. All right. So, yes, I know when you give your opinion to a certain issue, you have to go back to your beliefs or to your standpoint. What are the things that are embedded in your mind? Or in other words, what is your philosophy in life? Because um, your decisions would always be um, influenced by what are your philosophies. That's the reason why in your teaching profession class you were told to develop your philosophy in teaching. So it's actually similar in research because as a researcher, you need to identify your beliefs, your philosophical foundation or philosophical assumption. All right. So, in other words, kinahanglan nimo imong philosophical assumption so that you will know your direction, so that you will know where you are headed to as you conduct your research. Importante na siya. Okay, so this might be a very complex concept as for the moment, but later on you will realize it little by little as we will do, as I will discuss every part of this presentation. Okay, let me continue. Research of philosophical stance, philosophical assumptions, research philosophies. There are a lot of names given into this concept. In addition to that, it's also called as research traditions, philosophical paradigms or worldview lenses, epistemological paradigms or cultures of inquiry. So these tell us about the philosophical assumptions researchers have about the world and how to go about studying phenomena. A while ago, inyong na introduce ni Miss Floor and Sir Gandalf what a phenomena is. So um, you need your research philosophies or your philosophical stance as you will explore sa katong phenomena nga imuhang na-observe. So say for example, katong gi-use ganina ni Miss Floor about gamification. So the phenomena there is na-observe niya na-observe during the basic education nga every time nga ang lesson is being um sasagulan or integrated with gamification na ay kanang improvement of the learning sa mga students. So that's the phenomena. But how are you going to go about an study considering your philosophical assumptions? So as this research tradition or philosophical assumption you select will reflect about how you will know the world and how it will shape your decisions to make throughout the entire process of the research. So kani nga mga philosophical assumptions na upat ka buok or in some sources lima. So, in the pursuit of knowledge or what is truth, the following claims can be made by a researcher. The first is the ontology. Okay, ontology answers the question what knowledge is or what is knowledge. See, epistemology answers the questions how do we know it or how do we know the knowledge. Axiology, iha pong tubagon is what values are incorporated into it, and methodology, how we study or how do we study it, and the rhetoric is how do we write about it. Okay, these four or five key assumptions may have imposing sounding names, but they're understandable. When you design a research, there are certain kind of things you take for granted. So that is assumed. So that's why they called as assumptions. So you don't need to prove them or calculate them. You simply accept them as givens. Okay. So for us to have a better understanding into it, let's have an example. Okay. Say for example, you are trying uh, to explore the topic about leadership. Okay, so for leadership, on its ontological assumption, you you wish to study leadership, and you study the concept of leadership, and you take it for granted that leadership is something real. So we call this an ontological assumption from the Greek word that means reality. Okay, so mana siya ang ontological assumption. You assume nga leadership is something real. Mo na imong gi-assume, and you don't need to to give evidence. You just take it for granted, or you assume nga mao ni siya tinuod. You also assume that leadership can be studied productively, that we can learn something meaningful and useful about it. So this is now the epistemological assumption, which means knowledge. Okay, epistemological assumptions are about what can be known, and you take it for granted also that to learn about leadership would be a good thing, and that there are right and wrong ways to go about doing it. Okay, so monigingon nga axiological assumption. So this kind of assumption, kaning axiological assumption, comes from the Greek word axioma, meaning something that is worthy and fitting. And also, finally, you take certain methods for learning about leadership for granted. You assume that there are some methods of inquiry that will be workable and others that will not. So basically here, you are doing methodological assumption, and your methodological assumption will now be based on your previous three kinds of assumption. So they are all aligned. Okay, so you are now introduced with these four key assumptions. Now, there's a question, sir. Anang, it's still not clear for us about unsa man ni sila nga mga assumptions, because how do we know what we should assume? Like, unsa man mo pag-assume about ontological assumption aning a specific concept, the epistemological, axiological, and the methodological assumption. So the answer to that is in the paradigm we choose to work within. Okay? So dapat nasa tay paradigm in order for us to have those assumptions. Okay? And sir, what are those paradigms? These paradigms are the following. These are just the two major research paradigms, but there are actually a lot. So these two have stood the test of time since the days of Plato and Aristotle. They are logical positivism and the interpretivism. So si logical positivism, or this is a philosophy nga that holds that empirical evidence, okay? When we say empirical evidence, it means that everything can be measured by senses, that can be measured objectively, that we can uh, for example, the weight, the height, these are empirical observations na ma-measure gid nato. So we can that this is the only firm foundation for knowledge. Further, it also insists nga the valid knowledge can only be assumed, okay? if all observers come up with essentially the description of a thing. Okay? So, same ang ilang description of a thing. And it requires that this description be uniform across all researchers or observers, which leads to the requirement that measurement is the royal road to knowledge, which is the reason why if positivism is leaning towards quantitative research. Okay, the other way around, interpretivism, or otherwise known as social constructivism, this is now another philosophical stance. Okay, this paradigm or stance is actually more recent in development. However, ang iyang roots are in the philosophy of Plato and his teacher nga si Socrates, who mentioned that the truth, even if it is only dimly shadowed by human approximations, can only be approached through careful reflection and dialogue with others. Okay, so mo na yung gingon nga, for you to understand daw the phenomenon, okay, kung niingon si positivism nga kinahanglan to nimo i-measure, objective, empirical, ingon si interpretivism nga you need careful reflection and dialogue. So simply put, we can only interpret the truth, okay, not measure it. We can only know what we can learn in thoughtful discussion with other seekers also. So mao na siya ang two major research paradigms. Now, to give you a comparison ani nilang duha in terms of the different assumptions katong ontological, epistemological, etiological, rhetorical, and methodological assumption. So let's start ni post-positivist or positivist paradigm. Uh, let's still use the example that I gave katong exploring the leadership. Okay. Ingon in the point of view ni post-positivist, ingon siya in the ontological assumption nga leadership daw is fixed, it is stable, it is observable, and measurable. And that's the reason why in order for you to know the knowledge about leadership, your epistemological assumption this time, kinahanglan ka makuha lang to siya through scientific and experimental research. Kay ni believe si post-positivist that knowledge is objective and quantifiable. Okay? Then for the axiological assumption of a positivist research of a positivist paradigm, ingon siya nga ang leadership um, there is an emphasis on the objective researcher. Dapat value-free because subjectivity and bias lead to error. Mo na ang ingon ni positivist. Dapat wala kay bias, wala dili ka subjective as you will explore about leadership. And it will lead now to the rhetorical assumption, which is the language of research. So when you report the result of your research in ang sulat ninyo sa manuscript, you will use ingon si positivist nga you will use formal language and uses third person pronoun. Okay, if you that's what you can observe, especially if you are using a quantitative research design. And lastly here on the methodological assumption, so because mao to ang imong mga mao ang mga assumption ni positivist from ontological hangtod ni rhetorical, it is now fitting for you as a strategy to explore about leadership, kinahanglan either you can use any of these mga method, pwede kang mag-experimental, pwede kang mag-quasi-experimental, pwede po kang mabuhat og mga non-experimental, for example, correlation research. Basta the bottom line is, it is a quantitative method ang imuhang i-employ if you are following a positivist paradigm. Okay? So, on the other way around, mao to siya si positivist. Okay? Now, upon hearing this, unsa man ang imuhang kuan? Are you now convinced nga you are a positivist? Or if not yet certain baka, let's try to understand papod the interpretivist paradigm. Okay? So, let's still use the leadership. As ingon si interpretivist paradigm, ang leadership daw has multiple realities, and these are socially constructed by individuals. So meaning wala siya usa lang kabuok meaning o wala lang siya usa kabuok reality about leadership. Meaning daghan kaayo og reality unsa ang leadership. So it is different from this person, different from the other person and other else. And because daghan siya og realities, you can gain understanding about leadership by the process, by having the meaning of the process or experiencing it. So mo na ang iyang epistemological assumption of an interpretivist. That's the reason why ingon on the axiological ingon siya nga um, researchers subjective values ang researchers intuition o researchers biases are important, and learning participant subjective ideas are valuable. So ang giingon pod ni interpretivist nga kahit ang kanang subjectivity and bias kay importante ni siya when you conduct research, when you explore about leadership, dili pwede wag kangon ang imong bias because connected man siya. When you experience, you need to have your subjective experience pod. And that's the reason why as you will write your report of a paper following the interpretivist paradigm, kanita sa rhetorical assumption, you use an engaging style of narrative, you may use the first person pronoun and employs the language of a qualitative researcher. So with that, kay mao man to ang iyahang assumptions from ontological to rhetorical. So ang iyaha pong research strategies, ang iyang buhaton para mag-gain to ang knowledge about leadership is pwede niya buhaton ang phenomenology, ethnography, case study, grounded theory, heuristics ug mga generic nga qualitative method. Okay? So if you can observe there, basically if you are a post-positivist, you tend to go to a quantitative uh, design. But if you are an interpretivist, uh, you tend to lean on a qualitative research design. Okay, and what is the importance, ani sir? You need to make it sure that you know what your um, paradigm is. Okay? So with all this kanang koan, with all this meaning, now let me ask you, unsa man ang inyong paradigm? Okay? What is your philosophical stance? Are you leaning towards positivistic paradigm or an interpretivistic paradigm? Let me see it on your responses daw on the chat box. Does ang kana ba inyong mga research nga gipang conduct karon, does it mirror sa inyong paradigm gyud? For example, ang inyong gi-propose kay kanang qualitative, but sa inyong heart kay nag-believe mo nga quantitative ang inyong paradigm, or the other way around. Okay? So I see here Camellia is interpretive. Okay? Interpretivistic paradigm ang kuan si Camellia. What about the others? Okay? Do you believe that there's only one reality, or do you believe that there are multiple realities? Oh, ana siya. All right. If dili pa mo ka-decide, that's for now. I think it's kuan okay na siya, but it's important that you will have to find your identity as a researcher. Okay, to continue, for qualitative researches, katong mga research proposals that are qualitative design, you will clearly write your philosophical stance in your research manuscript in the introduction section, since a qualitative research does not have a theory. Okay? For those na himo og mga qualitative research pagkatong pag third year ninyo, did you include your philosophical stance? For example, nag-study mo og mga lived experience, nag-study mo og mga phenomenology, Did you include your philosophical stance in your manuscript? If not, at least this time, you need to include your philosophical stance. Si kuan gyud siya explicitly put into writing sa inyong research manuscript. So in your philosophical stance, you will clearly discuss your ontological, your epistemological, ecological, rhetorical, and methodological assumptions in the context of your study. Okay? So imo pong i-discuss imo mga assumptions base sa imuhang gi-explore nga study if you are um, having a qualitative research design. Now, to show you an example of how it is written, it's a bird's eye view. I will not really read this into verbatim. This is actually the study that I'm working with right now. I'm exploring on this research title, Online Distance Education Among Kindergarten Learners, Experiences of Parents During Pandemic. So basically, I'm doing here a qualitative research design, which is phenomenological design. Okay, this is a descriptive phenomenology. So I have to discuss here into writing my philosophical, if you know na may mabasa a theoretical stance because wala may theory ang phenomenology or a qualitative research as a whole. So I clearly discuss here my philosophical stance. So let's go to the next slide. Uh, if you can see here the highlights, na-highlight din ang mga each assumption that I made in this study that I am exploring. My ontological assumption, what is it about, what do I assume about the reality of the experiences of parents, how do I gain the meaning, how do I gain knowledge on their experiences, and what values do I explore or do I get in exploring the experiences of parents as they give their assistance sa ilahang mga kindergarten children during pandemic, and how will I write the study mo na siya si rhetorical, and what methods will I use or the strategies that I will use as I conduct the study. So na clearly na ko dira og butang on my philosophical stance. Okay? So for the quantitative, wala may ibutang part yun nga philosophical stance because naaman mo'y theoretical framework. Okay? Theoretical conceptual framework which will be discussed later on by Ma'am Elna. Okay? So basically, that is all that I would like to share to you. And to end again, I asked this a while ago, what is your research paradigm? That ends my talk right now. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you gain something about the philosophical stance or the philosophical assumptions or paradigm of being a researcher. Thank you.